Welcome to Codex, a history of video games. My name is Tyler Osby.
And I'm Mike Coletta.
And today we are talking about Chapter 22 in the Ultimate History of Video Games by Stephen L. Kent. This chapter is called The Year of Hardware. Mike, take it away.
Hey, everybody. It's me with my radio voice. Okay, what if I did that the whole podcast? That'd be amazing. Okay, so Nintendo was on fire in 1989. They were in the news a lot. Pop culture, they're taking it over, okay?
Okay.
And the three stories that really stood out to me were Nintendo engineers made a hands-free controller for quadriplegic people to play games.
Whoa.
Yeah, it involved like their chin would sit in this like lever and you would move your chin back and forth. It's kind of a directional control, so you could move Mario to the right by moving your head to the right. And then they would, this is what was really cool to me, the A and B buttons where you would blow into a straw or suck out of a straw. And that would control the A or B.
How do you press both buttons at the same time?
This is what I was thinking about. If you were running, you would just have to be blowing out your mouth a bunch and then suck in, I think, to make him jump.
Oh.
It's got to be crazy different. I want to try it so bad.
Yeah.
I want to figure this out. Okay, the second one is a burglar robbed a home, but was caught because he couldn't help but try out the NES they had as a family. Like he started playing the NES and then the cops came and he got arrested. And then the third story is at LAX, that's the Los Angeles International Airport for everyone out there.
Been there.
Yeah. Oh, I dread it, but I've been there. And security officers at LAX found an NES on the runway and didn't know what it was. And they called the bomb squad, and the bomb squad blew it up on the runway as like a way to get rid of a bomb. So that was pretty crazy.
Wow.
Yeah. So so Nintendo's big.
Yeah. They were just crushing it in 1989.
I will say that while they kept a tight lock on their game licenses, like we've talked about many times before. They were very into licensing their games. You only do 5 games a year, yada, yada, yada.
Yep.
They were very big on shutting down unlicensed companies. One company always slipped through the cracks, and that company was called Color Dreams, and they were never sued.
Why is that?
Mostly because of the genre they chose to work in with their games. So originally they started by making your standard rip-off unlicensed games like King Neptune's Adventure, Pest-Terminator, which is a great name for a game, Metal Fighter. But eventually they split off, and Color Dreams had an offshoot company called Wisdom Tree, and they found an entirely new market in Christian gaming.
Oh, is this like Christian rock?
Yeah,
but for games?
So for NES,
okay.
Exactly. So they ended up Wisdom Tree created 7 games for the NES, 4 Game Boy games, 3 Sega Genesis games, and 1 SNES game. And their first game was called Bible Adventures, released in December of 1990. And I watched a YouTube playthrough of this game, and there were 3 chapters. There was Noah's Ark, Baby Moses, and David Goliath. And I specifically watched the Noah's Ark one, and it involved you controlling Noah. You're a man in a robe, and you're collecting animals. You stack them on top of your head. So you could stack 1 monkey or 2 monkeys or like a cow, and then you'd carry them to this part of the ship, and then you'd throw them in this door, and then it would check off list would happen. So you got to get a male and female of each species, and that's how you beat the game. So you could not buy Wisdom Tree games in stores. You could only, like, I'm talking your conventional stores, like your Targets, your Toys R Us, no KB Toys,
your software, etc.
Yeah, you couldn't get it at Software Etc. You couldn't get a lot of things at Software Etc. It turns out. I've never been to a Software Etc.
It's what turned into GameStop.
Really?
There was a Software Etc. at the mall that I used to go to, and they sold video games, and then they turned into a GameStop. I'm pretty sure GameStop bought Software Etc. I'm pretty sure if I went through some of my old games, I could dig up a Software Etc. receipt.
I mean, yeah, we could Google it later, too. Yeah. I had no idea. That's crazy.
Yeah.
But the way you bought these games is they were only sold in Christian bookstores. It's the only place you could get one.
Oh.
Yeah. Even though the games were Christian, like the games were Christian games, the designers were still very much game designers. And there's like a small anecdote in the book about how one of the game designers, like the main programmer for Bible Adventures, would blow his paycheck in Vegas like every week. Like he would just leave and go to Vegas and waste all his money.
So they were Christian games. They were not
developed by Christian people.
or people of questionable ethics.
Yeah, I guess you could say it that way. Nintendo never went after Wisdom Tree because of the backlash they would think they would come because it would happen.
It's just a bad look.
And the games were actually really popular. Bible Adventures sold more than 350,000 copies.
Wow.
My favorite game that they made that I looked up was they bought the console license for Castle Wolfenstein 3D, and they renamed it Super 3D Noah's Ark, where instead of shooting Nazis with guns, you'd throw food at goats.
That's like the Chex version of Doom when they reskinned Doom as Chex Quest.
Oh, I remember Chex Quest.
Chex Quest was awesome. It wasn't just a reskin though. It was new levels and stuff, but all the guns were the same except for instead of killing enemies, they would just send them back to their own dimension.
I forgot. I played a lot of Chex Quest.
Yeah, that game is awesome.
Oh man.
Big fan of Chex Quest.
Everyone needs to talk more about Chex Quest.
Yeah.
I actually remember, I don't remember who it was, but I just spoke to someone when I said I'm starting a video game history podcast. They were like, I used to play this Bible game for the NES, and they were talking about Bible Adventures 100%. And I was like, this is so crazy we got here. Also, ignoring Wisdom Tree eventually was the right choice for Nintendo, I should say, because after the 16-bit generation of consoles, Wisdom Tree went all in on PC gaming and never made a console game again.
Yeah, there's just not a whole lot to be gained there. The potential like backlash of Nintendo being like anti-Christian or something like that would just end up being like not.
Yeah, because they already got flack from parents for being like, you're ruining my kid's life and they're playing video games all day and not going outside.
Yeah. And now as soon as I want them to play a Christian game, a nice wholesome game of Super 3D Noah's Ark,
now you're going to shut them down. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's like, you're ruining my kid's life and you're saying he loves the devil.
Right. It's just one of those things where you just, you know what? We'll just leave that one alone.
Yeah. Also in 1989, Sega's back.
Sega?
Oh,
they were probably Sega at that point.
Yeah, that's right.
They weren't edgy yet.
Sega broke off their deal with Tonka Toys. If you remember in the past, we talked about they had a deal with Tonka Toys to market the Master System.
Mm-hmm.
It failed pretty bad. They sold less than 1 million Master Systems over 2 years. And once the deal was over, Sega actually took back all that old inventory.
Wow.
And they had a lot of old inventory. But it wasn't a big deal, though, because they were focused on that point on the new system they had ready for the Japanese release. And that's when the Sega Mega Drive came out. It was the most impressive console at the time.
Wow.
And it was built around the 16-bit Motorola 68000 processing chip, which was the same chip Apple used for their first Macintosh computer.
Oh.
The 68000 could cycle twice as much data as the 8-bit MOS Technology 6502 chip found in the Nintendo Famicom. So it was way more powerful. The Mega Drive also had a 512-color palette and could display 64 colors on screen all at once, which is pretty nuts for the time.
Wow, so many colors.
Who doesn't want more colors?
Who needs any more colors than that, really?
Yeah, you don't. What's that?
I can't even think of any of
yellow, burnt sienna. You're starting to throw in some weird Crayola. Tickle Me Pink. Didn't they get rid of Tickle Me Pink and Crayola crayons? I heard there
Pacific Blue.
Oh, that's a good one.
Macaroni.
Hey, if you guys want, tweet at us your favorite Crayola color. Okay. The Mega Drive also to compare it with the NES had a 52 color palette instead of a 512 color palette. So way less colors.
Well, literally almost 10 times as many colors possible. Wow.
It was pretty big. Also, the Mega Drive had an entirely separate 8-bit processor just for sound. So sound quality through the roof, which we'll come back to later. All in all, this allowed the Mega Drive to produce games just as good as dedicated arcade machines. Because I didn't even realize this. We're talking about the 8-bit generation for home consoles. Arcades were still better than home console. I didn't put that together at this time.
Yeah, arcades were still crushing it. It's just easier to make a better arcade. You can make a more expensive arcade machine because a bar will pay for that.
Yeah, and it's also just the whole board is dedicated to one game. So you just have way more memory and storage to make that one game really shine graphically. So the hard part about the system would be marketing it in the US. And Hayao Nakayama, the CEO of Sega Enterprises, and David Rosen, who we talked about before as the guy who originally combined Sega together with David Rosen's company, they failed with Tonka Toys, so they decided we need to take a different route with this. And the route they took actually ended up being the exact same route Nintendo took before, where they tried to team up with Atari.
Wow. What happened there? That must have fallen through.
It fell through bad. Just like before with Nintendo, Sega got pretty far in the deal, but eventually David Rosen and Jack Tramiel, who owned Atari at this time, couldn't negotiate the terms.
Oh, this is such a recurring theme with Atari. Is like they had the thing that they needed with the 2600, and then after that, they couldn't get anything together. And then the things that would eventually replace them, Nintendo comes to Atari and says, hey, we want you to sell our product. This is your way back into the game. And Atari's like, nah.
Yeah.
And then Sega's like, hey, we have something here for you. This is your way back into the game, Atari.
And they're like, nope.
Like, nah. Oh,
it's like
Atari.
Jack Tramiel is afraid of success.
Yeah, that's a real bummer.
They're going to come back later, though. They do some cool stuff later.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, we need to talk about a man who we mentioned before, and his name, because a lot of the time in the video game industry, you'll notice there's a lot of people moving around the same companies. It's a very small group of people at this time doing it, especially executives. And one person named Michael Katz, who we talked about before, was in the industry. He worked for everyone, essentially. And we actually originally talked about him because he worked as the marketing director for Mattel, and he oversaw the creation of the first handheld games.
Oh, yeah. Okay. And Mattel's the one that did like the Intellivision, right?
Yeah. But he was the one that made those handheld games that were like football.
And
just called football or just called racing. Mm-hmm. So I will now attempt in quick succession to say all the places that Michael Katz worked.
Okay.
So first we have Mattel, which I just mentioned. Mm-hmm. Then he went on to Coleco, where he was the vice president of marketing for 5 years.
The Connecticut Leather Company?
That's right. Then he moved to California and became president of a software company called Epyx. That's EPYX.
Those are the people that Data East would sue over their karate games.
That's right. And where he completely turned that company around by purchasing a small company called StarPath. And that company StarPath created a hit line of Olympic-themed games that they didn't finish. But then when they were picked up by Epyx is like, no, let's release these. And they were released for Commodore 64, and they were hugely successful. They had summer games, winter games. They even had one called California Games.
Oh, is that like the X Games?
I feel like it's the X Games, yeah. So it's pretty cool. I mean, it's no Skate or Die, but it's pretty up there.
It's no Tony Hawk's Pro Skater.
That's right. And while at Epyx, he also helped two inventors named R.J. McCall. Is it Michael or McCall?
I don't know. It's definitely not spelled like Michael is.
It's not. And David Needle designed a color handheld video game system in 1986. And I believe you're going to talk about this more later.
Yeah. We'll dive into that a little bit.
Yeah. And because he actually gets him on board at Epyx to design this system. But some stuff happens to that system, and I'm going to leave it a little open-ended so we don't repeat ourselves.
Okay.
Then Jack and Sam Tramiel convinced Katz to leave Epyx and join Atari. It was all decided at one business lunch, very businessy, where Katz said that if he got a video game job, it could help fund and design the Atari ST computer, which was a big thing they were trying to build right now at Atari. Yeah. So he's like, hey, give me some video game stuff. It'll fund that computer project that you really care about.
Yeah. Jack and Sam were really, that's probably the biggest reason they were passing on all these like Nintendo deals and Sega deals. They were like, but we want to make computers.
Yeah, and I think he was the one that told them, you can make computers, but you got to have the video game profits to fund that.
Yeah.
So he joined I think it was called their computer entertainment division or something along those lines. And he oversaw the re-release of the Atari 7800 console. Because if you recall, this came out, not a lot of fanfare.
Yeah.
And it wasn't doing very well. But when they re-released the Atari 7800, this was not meant to compete with Nintendo's billion-dollar hold on the market. It was instead meant to be a cheaper alternative because it was $30 less than the NES. So while it barely did a dent in Nintendo's sales, it brought Atari back from the brink in 1988. And they had their best year since 1982, which is right before the fall of Coin-Op Arcade. And they had $452 million in revenue just off the re-release of the Atari 7800. So it kind of saved Atari and helped fund that computer.
Even though it didn't like win that generation, it like still made a bunch of money off of it.
Yeah, that's one thing I noticed with Michael Katz. He plays the smart marketing strategy, which we're going to find out more of in a second, because he took a 3-month vacation where he decided to travel the world, and then he decided he would join Sega as the CEO of Sega of America in October of 1988.
Whoa.
So he did some jumping just from Mattel all the way to Sega. Before Katz was hired, though, the Genesis was released in America on August 14th, 1989, but it was only available in New York and Los Angeles.
Kind of like the NES.
Exactly. They did the exact same thing with the test market.
Yeah.
Genesis sold for $189 and came with one controller and one game, Altered Beast, which is really strange. I was just talking to a friend, and he mentioned Altered Beast because we were at a GameStop, and they had a Funko Pop for it.
Yeah. Everybody thinks that Sonic was like the first game that came out for this Genesis. Sonic was a few years later.
Yeah, Altered Beast came out first, and it was a huge success because for the first time, the protagonist was about half the size of the screen, and he had full facial features. Like, you could see the detail. That's what Sega was going for. Like, hey, look at this. Our system's really good looking, which people still do, like companies still do today. Like when Xbox One came out and they had Rise, Son of Rome, and that was a gorgeous game.
It's like, look at the face. You can see his face.
Look at his face. So that came out first. But then Katz, when he was made CEO of Sega of America, he was hired to help move the Genesis in its nationwide release. And Katz decided to market an attack on two fronts. First, he would call out Nintendo, showing the technological superiority of the Genesis compared to the NES. And then he would then follow it up with a call-out marketing campaign. And their slogan was, Genesis does what Nintendo don't.
Oh, that's pretty strong.
That was their big marketing. So that was the first thing he did. The second thing he did was take games, because Nintendo had control of the licenses of all the good arcade ports. So it was up to Katz to find new ways to make games. And the way he did it is he took athletes and celebrities' names and images and paid to use them in his games. So Sega made games like Pat Riley's basketball, Arnold Palmer golf, Buster Douglas boxing, and Joe Montana football. So these games are what made the Sega what it was. Joe Montana football was pretty big. Sega signed a 5-year licensing agreement with Joe Montana, and they paid him $1.7 million up front.
Whoa.
And over the course of the 5-year agreement, the guesstimate was Joe Montana made about $2.5 to $3.5 million more.
Wow.
During that time. The problem with creating the first Joe Montana football was in August, they had to get the game out by Holiday Rush.
Oh, that's when they signed the deal, was in August?
Yeah, so they're like, how do we do this? And the way they knew they had to do it is they had to find a company that was already making a football game and relicense it, and then put Joe Montana's likeness on it. The first company they found was called Mediagenic, formerly known as Activision. Yeah,
I guess they changed their name?
At this, we get to find out more about this later, I imagine, but Activision at one point did change their name to Mediagenic.
Oh, wow.
And the game, they signed Mediagenic to do this, but the game was nowhere near ready by October. So then they're like, oh no, we have to bail on Mediagenic and find a game that is pretty much done. Like completely finished. And what they did is Sega turned to Electronic Arts, who were already known for a very successful PC game franchise called John Madden Football.
Oh.
Yeah, so EA agreed to help Sega, and they created the first Joe Montana football. But what is crazy about these games is they were made by the same company, but completely different.
Oh, so it wasn't just reskinned Madden.
No, it was John Madden Football was a separate game than Joe Montana Football. So John Madden was about, like it is now, about picking plays, which were actually designed by John Madden himself, which I thought was a cool detail.
Oh, that's cool.
And matching and like marching down the field strategically, and there were 32 NFL teams to choose from. It was like you were playing in the NFL. Meanwhile, Joe Montana Football was all about just like an arcade, fast action focused experience. Like you're throwing passes, you're running, you're like juking people out. It's like a
less
big,
strategic, more like action.
Yeah, it's supposed to be fun. Just like a quick, you jump in, you jump out.
That's cool.
So both games were successful, and Madden was eventually released on the Sega Genesis as well, which I remember seeing a Sega Genesis cartridge as a kid that was John Madden, which I thought was I'm like, oh, I'm just going down memory lane now, so this feels nice. The biggest hit of all these games, though, and we've mentioned it, I think, a long time ago, was Michael Jackson's Moonwalker. Nice. Released on the Sega Genesis in 1989. It involved Michael Jackson exploring pool halls, graveyards, and criminal hideouts, saving kidnapped children. That was the game.
Wow.
And the game ended when Michael Jackson turned into a giant robot and fought Mr. Big, who was the bad guy in the music video, and that was played by Joe Pesci. And apparently in the video game, it looks a lot like Joe Pesci. So
wow.
Good job there. The coolest part of the game was the choreographed dance moves and synth versions of Michael Jackson's songs. Like Michael Jackson even helped make the game. He was involved in the process. The best part about this period for Sega, and this is what makes me really like personally happy, is Sega in 1989 never abandoned the Master System yet.
Oh.
They even released Michael Jackson's Moonwalker on the Master System eventually.
Oh.
So they were kind of helping out. They were still like, it's kind of like now where they're like, okay, we'll still make some games on the One a lot, but we'll still make games on 360, you know? Or like put ports on the 360 for those games. So they came out with Michael Jackson's Moonwalker and Sonic the Hedgehog already on the Master System. Which was nice. Because I think... Oh, go ahead.
That's funny because one of the things that Michael Jackson, like one of the ways that they sort of advertised for Moonwalker was Michael Jackson was like, the Genesis is the only system that can handle my music. And then they're like, but also the Master System can do it.
Yeah, yeah, right. I remember reading that. And then also the Master System came out with a power base converter adapter.
Oh, to put in your Genesis.
Yeah,
you could play.
So you could play Master System games on Genesis. I feel like Sega... And this comes up in a later chapter, I believe, but Sega really cared about if you were a parent and you just bought your kid a $300 video game system, it's going to have a shelf life of like 5 years. They're like, we want to make it so people can keep using their Master System, which is nice for the consumer, I think, because that would be a real big bummer if you were a kid and you got this Master System for Christmas and then the next year the Genesis comes out and then Sega just abandons you.
Yeah.
So... That's what I liked about the Sega stuff. And yeah, I forgot about the Michael Jackson 8-bit thing. That's very funny.
I remember when the PlayStation 2 had come out and companies were still making games for the PS1. Like they still put out like Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2, 3, and 4 for the original PS1.
That's
And
awesome.
I remember being like, that's really cool that they put these games on PS1 because I don't have a PS2 yet.
Yeah, that's nice of them. And that means they care. And they have a whole market there with people.
Yeah.
So, and that's that. So that's where we leave off for Sega now. We're going to talk more about Sega later on in this a little bit, I think.
Yeah, we're
chapter.
We're gonna focus a little bit on Electronic Arts now.
Should we mention this real quick though too, since we're getting into the console wars thing?
Oh yeah.
So console wars is a huge part, the battle between Nintendo, Super Nintendo, and Sega Genesis. So we are going to come back and do a whole episode on this, but we're kind of blowing through the summary history. This is the timeline.
Yeah, we're giving you the overview now. We're going to plan to go in depth on a lot of these.
And we were actually
just
just talking today about how excited we are, the things we can go in depth on, because we have some ideas. And so we will come back to console wars at some point. I just don't want you to be like, hey, why are you skipping over this crazy part? We're going to get there.
We'll probably still cover some more in later chapters of this book too, but we definitely want to do like a whole episode dedicated to the console wars, or maybe even more than one.
Yeah. So we just want to let you know that. But now let's talk about EA.
So back at EA, in 1989, it was starting to become clear that 8-bit systems were on the way out and that 16-bit systems were headed in. So EA did not want to make 8-bit games anymore. So they thought, when they decided to make console games, they thought the Genesis would be the best place to do that. They didn't want to make any NES games. What's weird, though, is when they signed that deal with Sega, their stock dropped immediately. People, like, it wasn't, like, clear what the difference between 8-bit and 16-bit games were. And so, people weren't necessarily ready for these new systems to come out, I guess. So they weren't ready for the Genesis to be on the way. EA they really didn't want to, like, downgrade their games to be able to be played on older things. They were kind of the first, not the first, but one of the more prominent members of like this PC elitism. They were like, we only make games for computers, and computers are way better.
Totally subscribe to our PC master race. Is what you're saying?
That's right. Yeah. EA was big on PC. So Trip Hawkins himself, the guy that created EA and ran EA, was openly critical of Nintendo. And he never thought Nintendo was going to succeed. Trip was going to be wrong about that, and Nintendo would go on to crush it. The Genesis also, this is also a big deal for EA, less restrictive on licensing than Nintendo was at the time. So that helped sweeten the deal a bit for EA too. EA kept their eyes on that Tengen lawsuit with Atari, between Atari and Nintendo, because they knew that once it was okay to reverse engineer games, that they'd be able to make games for the Genesis, and they'd be able to do it without a license.
I love that.
Because they knew that precedent for that case, even though it was Nintendo versus Atari, that precedent would probably hold up for a lot of other cases too, for other systems as well. So EA's engineers were already familiar with the 16-bit chip in the Genesis because, like you said before, it's the same one used in the Atari ST, the Commodore Amiga, and the Apple Macintosh computers. They decided that they didn't need this deal with Sega, but once they made that decision that they didn't need this deal, they went to Sega anyway, and they were like, hey, let's try to make a deal anyway. They were like, look, we can do this without you. We don't need your blessing. We know how your system works. We know how to make our own cartridges for it. We don't need you. But we would like to. So if you want to give us a sweet deal on these cartridges and like on this licensing, let's do it. They ended up getting a really good deal with Sega, and they had really good royalty rates. And it allowed them to make their own cartridges. So you may remember EA cartridges being like a little bit bigger and having like, they just looked different. It's because EA actually made their own cartridges. And they still had a deal with Sega, so it was still officially licensed Sega stuff. So they got the kind of the best of both worlds there. Sega gave EA a lot more control than they usually gave other companies at the time. So in 1990, EA released 2 games, Populous and Budokan, the Martial Spirit. They also released Zany Golf and John Madden Football just a few months later. Madden, of course, would go on to be a juggernaut that still sells well.
It's crazy that it started back then.
Yeah.
Such a long
way back then.
franchise.
So that's sort of the history of EA being on Sega consoles. Like that's sort of how that started, the genesis of that.
I see what you did there.
Thanks. So the next system I want to talk about is the TurboGrafx. This whole chapter is basically just about like a lot of the different hardware that was coming out, because in 1989 it was getting towards the end of the 8-bit era, and so there's this like, okay, what's coming next? There's a lot of hardware on the horizon that had a few years to be developed.
But the SNES is not in the picture yet.
Not yet. They're definitely working on it, of course, at this point in time, but it's not on the horizon just yet. But what is a little system called TurboGrafx, the TurboGrafx 16. also known as the PC Engine in Japan. So TurboGrafx 16 was developed by NEC and released in 1989 in the United States, 1987 in Japan, again, as the PC Engine. It used an 8-bit CPU, but they were able to use some kind of trickery to make it a 16-bit system. It was kind of a halfway point between 8 and 16-bit. Some portions of it were 8-bit, some portions were 16-bit. So there's a little bit of trickery going on there. Bits mattered at this point in time. When you're talking about the way you market things, the way you say you're better than something else is by saying you have more bits than it. Basically, that's what consumers didn't necessarily know what this meant, but they knew that more bits was better.
You know what to me, Tyler? What? You're infinite bits. That's how good you are.
Wow. Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, no problem.
Infinite bits. That's what we should have called this podcast.
Oh, we might change the name.
Infinite bits. So yeah, and it was also sort of an anchoring point for consoles to use when comparing to each other. Like, you wouldn't compare the Genesis to the regular Nintendo necessarily, knowing that one was an 8-bit system and the other was 16-bit. You just knew which one was better. So anyway, TurboGrafx used that to their advantage by marketing their system as a 16-bit system. When it became clear that it wasn't a fully 16-bit system, the competition would use that to say, hey, the TurboGrafx 16 isn't really 16-bit for all these reasons. So it was kind of a double-edged sword for them. It allowed them to market as a 16-bit system and other people to market against them as if it were an 8-bit system. So back in a little history of the hardware here, NEC had been wanting to enter the hardware market for a little while, but they didn't really have the experience or like the brand recognition to make it. But at the time, a company called Hudson was making graphics chips, and they were shopping them around to Nintendo, who eventually refused them. So Hudson teamed up with NEC and decided to build a competitor. If Nintendo was like, we're not going to buy your chips, they were like, fine.
We'll go to someone else.
Yeah.
We don't need you.
That's right. So the PC Engine did super well in Japan. They were able to get some really prominent third-party developers like Konami and Namco to make games for it. It was the Famicom's biggest competition in Japan, because in 1987, when it came out in Japan, this was very squarely early NES Famicom territory. Those were the things that were competing. So it actually did really, really well against the Famicom in Japan. It didn't do so well in the United States. It had a few advantages over the Genesis, hardware-wise, but Sega was a much more known name in the industry, and they'd been cranking out the Master System and arcade games, so they had the brand recognition there.
I feel like this is just like with the Master System and the original NES, where Nintendo had the market already, so Sega tried to struggle in, and now Sega has the market, and TurboGrafx is trying to get in again.
Yeah, and this is to say nothing of Nintendo, who didn't have a 16-bit competitor yet, but everybody knew there must have been
There's something going on.
Yeah. So yeah, the TurboGrafx was definitely behind the Genesis in terms of power, but it could show more colors on the screen at once, which was kind of neat.
Whoa.
The games came on things called Hue cards, or they were called Turbo cards in the US, which was the technology that Hudson had developed for Sega's earlier console, the Master System. So the Master System could take standard cartridges like any other thing, but it also had these weird like card things that it could play games off of, like credit card sized sort of cartridge kind of deal. That was actually developed by Hudson, and so they continued that with the TurboGrafx. And they could hold a lot of data, actually. They were credit card sized. It's really interesting kind of deal.
I have a friend that has a TurboGrafx, and he informed me, because we were talking about this, we were talking about video games, and he was like, I have a TurboGrafx, I just don't have a power supply for it, and I don't know where you get one. And I'm like, dude. And I just Amazoned it instantly right there. So I'm like, we got to get this thing running so we can play it.
Yeah, got to play those smart cards.
That's
those,
right.
Turbo cards. NEC also announced and launched a CD-ROM add-on for the system. So,
ooh, it's the first one of that, right?
Yeah, the first system to have a CD-ROM add-on, first home console. And it would sort of be the first kind of like hardware add-on and start that trend, because later we'll see it with the Sega CD, the Sega 32X, the ill-fated Nintendo PlayStation, which I'm sure we'll talk about someday.
The Xbox 360 HD DVD hard drive?
Yeah, that's right. CD-ROMs were awesome for games because they held a ton of data, which meant you could have lots of levels, you could have better graphics, you could have music in your game, like actual CD quality music that was like recorded music, which was pretty neat. Lots of those CD games with CD music where you could pop them in your CD player and just listen to the soundtrack, which was kind of cool. The biggest problem with CDs, especially at the time, was that the hardware to play CDs was really expensive, prone to failure, had a lot of issues, and CD systems are just slower, so they have to load. Like you notice in old Nintendo games, there's never any loading screens. When you start playing games with CDs, you start to get loading screens because they're just slower. That's actually one of the biggest things that Nintendo would say is the reason they didn't go to optical-based disk drives for a long time, until the GameCube actually in 2001. They were like, we don't want slow loading times. We want fast loading times.
And plus the GameCube, didn't they have the little mini disc things?
Yeah.
Little baby CDs.
Yeah, little baby CDs, little optical. They were based on DVDs. I think also another reason why Nintendo didn't really want to do CD-based stuff was it was a lot easier to pirate that stuff.
Oh, you can just burn it.
Right, you just burn games. And a lot of these systems would have various like levels of copy protection. Like you couldn't just burn a game for a PlayStation. You had to make some other modifications. But Nintendo really hates piracy, and so they held on to their control over that stuff for a long time, which is a big reason that Nintendo 64 had cartridges. But I digress. That's the TurboGrafx 16. I don't have any particular like fond memories of a TurboGrafx 16. I didn't play one. I don't really know of any awesome games for it. It seems like it did much better in Japan than it did here, but it seems remiss to leave it out.
I gotta talk to my friend because I'm like, that's kind of crazy that he had one.
Yeah.
If it was not selling as well here as it did in Japan.
Yeah. So I don't know. Anyway, it's interesting. Maybe we could do a whole episode on that too. That might be interesting to dig into.
And then also, we just didn't want to leave people out that had a TurboGrafx 16 and are listening to this podcast holding it lovingly.
Right.
And being like, they better talk about you. Janice. They named it Janice.
just holding it, like crying over it.
Let's all name our consoles. Do you name your consoles?
No.
Do you name your computer?
Yeah.
What's your computer's name?
This computer's name is Mariella.
Ooh, that's a really good name.
Yeah, it's a reference to a Kate Nash song called Mariella.
I like that.
Yeah.
Mine old one was named Bastard. This one's named Rahul.
Master Rahul.
What you got there, Guardian? Okay, sorry.
So back to Nintendo. What's Nintendo doing at this point in time? The competition is heating up. Surely they were worried about what was coming from NEC and Sega, right? They had to be worried. They were not. They didn't care. They were like, we're Nintendo. We can't be beat. So they didn't see Sega or NEC as a threat. Nintendo felt like they were invincible and that no one would ever defeat them. And they had pretty good reason to think that. They kept making money hand over fist. The NES was great. They just kept expanding. Two of their licensees, Konami and Acclaim, would buy second licenses from them so that they could make more games. And they had to do this under a different like company name. So Konami made a company called Ultra, and Acclaim made a company called LJN. I don't remember anything prominent that LJN made. I could be wrong about that. But Ultra would publish games like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. They would publish Metal Gear. They would publish Skate or Die.
What? I just mentioned that.
Yeah. And they would publish the Jaybird ripoff, Qbert, for the NES.
That's right. I like in the notes is Jaybird crossed out and then Qbert. We're really sticking to our guns here about Jaybird.
Jaybird is definitely the superior.
Yeah, because it wasn't the whole reason they made the separate name because they could only do 5 games.
Right.
So the agreement was they could do 5 more games. They had to just have a different name. So it didn't.
So they made whole separate companies to do this.
Wasn't that? There was more for other license companies too, right? So the other license companies weren't just like, wait, why do they get 5 more games?
Yeah, they get 5 more games because they literally made a whole other company.
Yeah.
It's not just a different brand. It's a whole different company. Like Ultra is like a registered company or was a registered company.
Crazy.
So like that's how they got around this was just they bought more licenses from Nintendo.
Oh, business stuff. Also didn't in the book, this is when Nintendo hit like 2.3 billion in sales. Right?
Oh yeah.
This is that point where they were making billions.
They were just riding high.
That's
off
crazy.
Of video games.
Good. No wonder they didn't feel nervous. They're making billions of dollars.
In 1989, Nintendo did have some new hardware. Not quite the same as what Sega or NEC were putting out, but they had something called the Game Boy. Designed and developed by Gunpei Yokoi, the Game Boy was the first cartridge-based handheld since the Microvision in 1979.
It's crazy because you would think Game Boy was first, but no. And then 79.
Yep.
That's crazy.
In classic Gunpei Yokoi fashion, it wasn't the most powerful portable device, but it was cheap. They were able to make it cheap from high-quality parts, so it was built like a tank.
That original Game Boy was a brick.
Yeah.
It was huge. Did you have... I never had the original.
Yes, I had an original Game Boy. Still works.
Do you still have it?
Yeah. I could dig it up at home probably. There's actually a really cool picture online I think it's in one of the Nintendo stores in like New York of the Game Boy that survived like a bombing during the Gulf War and still works. Like it still shows Tetris today. Like
That's
just like
crazy.
the Tetris demo.
I love it.
So it still runs today in like this charred plastic body. It's definitely seen some stuff. The hardware was also super power efficient, which meant that it could run for 10 hours on 4 AA batteries, which was something the competition couldn't claim.
I forgot AA's were just the way you did things.
Yeah.
I remember that. I would get so many AA's for like road trips for Game Boy. I had a Game Boy Color, so that was the one I used AA's
Yeah,
on
and that
all the
one
time.
was even better. But yeah, most of the other handhelds around this time would run off like 6 AA's and they'd last for only a few hours. But because the Game Boy was using kind of some older hardware and some less powerful hardware, they were able to get a lot more life out of those batteries, which is one of the most important parts of a portable system, because if you got dead batteries, you can't play it.
Yeah.
So the best portable system is not the one with the best hardware. It's the one that you can play.
That's right.
Right?
You got to have games.
You got to have games.
You got to be playable.
And you got to have batteries.
That's right.
So they launched the system with Tetris, which was a perfect match for a portable system because it had simple graphics, which looked really great on the system's signature pea soup green screen.
I forgot it was green.
Yeah, it's like really gross. Even for the time, that screen was pretty bad. They launched with 3 other games also: baseball, breakout, and golf.
Breakouts just should be like a game of the year for life. It's in so much stuff.
Yep, and Tetris as well. But the real bombshell from what we'd seen on the NES... Wait. I just skipped a line while I was reading my notes.
It's a bombshell release a few weeks later.
Released a few weeks later, Super Mario Land.
Ooh, I never played this game.
Yeah, it's so good. So it's like different from Mario on the NES, but it's like still feels the same. Like the worlds are very different, and there's sections. There's like a section where you're like in a submarine, piloting a submarine. The last level, you're piloting like a plane.
Is this the game where you go into the giant Wario?
No, that's Super Mario Land 2.
Oh, that's the one I remember playing.
6 golden coins.
That's right.
Yeah, that's a great game. But Super Mario Land is really cool because it felt as big and as expansive as like a regular Mario game, but they had perfectly shrunk it down to being playable on a Game Boy. It's just a really great game and really delivers on like the reason you play Mario on the NES is the reason you play Super Mario Land on the Game Boy, and it's like it just perfectly sort of...
Did you have Super Mario Land for your Game Boy?
Yep.
Oh, you still do, don't you?
Yep. I used to, I played that game a lot because I had a Game Genie also. And so I would turn on like Infinite Lives or the ability to like run through walls and stuff. I had so much fun.
Dude, if you didn't have it, you can get it on eBay for $7.99.
Yeah, it's a pretty common cartridge.
It's good.
It's available for pretty cheap.
Oh, I'm going to go down a rabbit hole. If I got to look away. Keep going.
So the Game Boy sold like crazy. They shipped 1 million units to the US for launch, and that only met half of the demand for the system. So the sales just kept going. Like as long they just were selling them as fast as they could make them, which is pretty crazy considering there was some pretty stiff competition in the handheld space, like the Atari Lynx. So remember when we talked about RJ Michael at Epix?
Yeah, Epix.
Mm-hmm. Epix, just Epix, not Epix.
Just Epix.
Just Epix. So he was working. This is a little bit before Epix. He was working at Atari on the Amiga when he met a guy, or not? Was it Atari that made the Amiga? No, it was Commodore that made the Amiga. Sorry.
Yeah.
He was working at Commodore on the Amiga when he met a guy named Dave Needle, who you mentioned earlier as well. They became fast friends because they shared a similar philosophy about developing hardware and software. Now, like traditionally, hardware was made, and it was just like made in this black box, and then it was handed over to software engineers, and they were like, here, make software for it. But what RJ and Dave wanted to do was they wanted to make hardware at the same time as software so that the hardware could be made with what the software engineers wanted, and the software engineers could like make software that would run like super well with the hardware. They just wanted a more like intertwined development cycle.
Cohesive unit.
Right. They didn't want it to just go from hardware to software. They wanted like lots of love between the two.
You know, there's like this war going on between hardware and software engineers, and it's got to stop. They just got to learn to love each other.
Yep, and that's what RJ and Dave wanted to do.
Like, hey, Mike, are you kind of over-exaggerating and making up this war? Maybe, you know?
Yeah.
But I feel like they just want love.
That's right.
Love wins.
So both of them left Amiga in 1985. A little while later, they started talking about building a handheld system together that would embody their philosophy. Originally, they wanted to use like a 16-bit chip, but they found that it ran too hot and it was too big and heavy. They ended up using a chip very similar to the 6502 that was used in the NES and the Atari 2600. So they also used some other 16-bit-ish chips in there as well, enough that it could be marketed as like a 16-bit handheld, which, again, at the time was very important. If you wanted to be ahead of the competition, you needed to be 16 bits. So they had to figure out a way to make it 16-bit. So they started shopping this idea around, and eventually they sold it to Michael Katz at Epix.
He returns.
We talked about him earlier. At the time, they were calling it the handy game. Because it was just handy, pull it out of your pocket, play games.
Very handy.
That's right. So Katz left Epix, but the handy game development marched on. The screen wasn't super great, but it was in color. It was the first color handheld. It scratched very easily. It was kind of blurry. It did well with motion, which a lot of other color screens at the time didn't do so well with, but anyway,
it was the first color one.
It was the first color one. It burned batteries super fast. It just you just couldn't keep it running. They learned about this like bug that they had that would sort of become an inside joke for them. They called it Emag Tresny, which when they said that basically was referring to the fact that no matter how meticulously something is planned, something will always go wrong. So the reason it's called Emag Tresny, which I'll spell this out for you, is EMAG space TRSNI. The reason they used that was because they had worked so hard on the system. They worked very hard with their hardware engineers or software engineers to make something, but a misplaced 1 that should have been a 0 meant that the error message that popped up when there was no cartridge in would read Emag Tresny instead of insert game. So it's insert game backwards. So they would say that. They'd be like, oh, yeah, well, we plan this all out. And then they'd just be like, yeah, but Emag Tresny, man, you can't plan for everything.
I'm going to use that in my life.
So, yeah, Epix wasn't able to keep itself afloat, so they sold the handy game to Atari. Lots of people at Epix were not big fans of Atari, and they didn't like the idea of working with Atari, so a lot of them left, including R.J. Michael and Dave Needle. But Atari kept the system, and they started calling it the Lynx because it had the ability to link 8 handhelds together for multiplayer.
That's pretty crazy for the time to link it for multiplayer.
Yeah. So it was pretty neat. Also, Lynx was good because this was about the time when Atari would start naming their products after cats. Like they would really later release like the Jaguar.
I like that. Who doesn't like a Lynx? It's got those weird like ear hair things that go up top.
Yeah.
I'm talking about the cat now, not the handheld.
Well, if you look at a Lynx, it kind of has weird ear things on it. It was pretty neat too because you could play it left or right-handed, so you could flip it around.
And
it would just work, I guess. Yeah, it's pretty interesting. Atari was not, though. They were not able to market it like Nintendo was able to market the Game Boy, and ultimately they just had to call it quits. So they had a problem. They had a marketing problem. They just couldn't get it out in front of people. It cost twice as much as a Game Boy. It had worse battery life, and it had no games.
Atari Lynx has no games.
Game Boy had games.
That's right. You gotta
Super
have
Mario
games.
Land, Tetris, Breakout, golf, tons of games.
Playable.
On the Game Boy. Yep.
You gotta have games. That's all it's all about.
Yep, that's right. So that's where we leave off here. This is sort of 1989 in a nutshell. We're on the cusp.
All the hardware in 1989.
Yeah, we're on the cusp of a new generation. Some people are getting there earlier than others. Sega's there. NEC is there. Nintendo has sidetracked a little bit by releasing the Game Boy, but they'll be there too soon. So that's where we leave off in 1989.
That's right. In the next chapter, just a little teaser.
Mm-hmm.
It's called Run for the Money. Whoa.
It's going to heat up.
It's going to heat up. About 16-bit consoles heating up.
Yeah. Can't wait.
So, yeah. And then, I feel like Tyler and I are already talking about what we're going to do when we're done with the book because it's coming up fast. The book's almost over.
It's kind of scary. We're getting to the end of this book and we're like, oh, no. We have to make actual content.
We got to have someone to help. We're losing our mentor.
Yeah.
Stephen L. Kent, what happened to you?
Yeah. He's been really guiding us along here, and now we're going to have to make our own way.
But I think we know what direction we're going to go in, and that pretty much, to me, is console by console.
Yeah, I think
that's how we'll do
console
it.
By console, we can do just specific topics and just really drill deep into them.
Yeah, we're going to do games. We're going to do all sorts of stuff. Not necessarily in order anymore, which I'm excited about because we can really go into what we want to talk about that week. Like, especially if something's going on overall in gaming news, we can talk about something related to it in the past.
Yep.
I think it would be cool.
Yeah.
So, what have you been playing, Tyler?
Well, we finally got our Whisper of the Worm in Destiny.
Yeah. Oh, I forgot about this. We got carried by a 14-year-old boy.
Yeah. We were just like, all right, let's do this. And he was a total monster and
He was a
really carried
beast.
us. Yeah.
I gotta say, people dog on playing with kids in online games, but this kid was a MVP.
Yeah, he knew what was up and he really carried us through.
He showed us
this
the
whole thing.
strategy, and now we can carry our friends.
Yep, we ran through it several times with him. We got a bunch of the other stuff you need because you get the gun and then there's some other stuff you can upgrade on it, and that's what we were working on.
It was a real fun time.
Yeah, it was a really fun time. So yeah, that's about all the Destiny I played. I put in a lot of time on World of Warcraft still. I'm level 115, so making my way to the end game stuff. Really excited to start running some mythic dungeons and maybe even get into some raiding.
Ooh, I have not been playing many video games. I'm moving.
Oh boy.
I'm focusing on that. The podcast will be fine. Hey,
Yeah.
don't worry. The podcast is going to be okay. I'm going back to Seattle. Everything will be all right. Everyone stay calm.
But we're going to have to start recording separately.
We are going to start recording separately, but we have the technology to make it not sound like
Yeah,
butt.
hopefully you never know.
Yeah, so
Right.
but I haven't been playing a lot of games because of that. So I played Destiny with you a little bit, and then I picked up Pokemon again on my wonderful Nintendo 2DS, and I mean, it's fun. I'm taking a little breather, you know, because I really don't feel like playing Mass Effect right now. I don't feel like I have the time I can commit to falling into that story.
Yeah.
So I want to just take a little breather, get all my stuff together, and then dive right back in. But now I'm thinking I might just jump into League of Legends a little bit.
Oh, boy.
Because I never played it. I'm ready to jump in that solo queue and get beaten all the time.
Yeah.
Just lose a lot. I'm ready to lose a lot. I'm feeling it.
And that's the way it goes.
So I'm going to
That's
do
okay.
that. But thank you so much for listening to the podcast. People that listen to the podcast, it means the world to us. As always, Tyler is on Twitter at SneakerElf, ELPH.
That's right.
I am on Twitter at mecoletta, MECOLETTA. You can email us at codexhistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can rate and review and subscribe to us on iTunes because it really helps and it means the world to us. And we'll shout you out on the show. I might even say your full legal name, but don't put it out on there because I'll just read things blindly.
It's true. He reads whatever you put in front of him.
I'm crazy. I'm like Ron Burgundy. So thanks so much for listening, though. And is there anything else you want to add, Tyler? You got anything? All
That's
right.
it.
Thank you so much. Have a great week. Bye-bye.
Bye.